Stefan the Great, the champion of Christ, cousin of the notorious Vlad the Impaler, nemesis of the mighty Mehmed the Conqueror. Stefan III of Moldavia is remembered today by those across Moldova and Romania as a national hero and a canonized saint. This is his story. The exact year of the mighty Stefan's birth is unknown, with estimates ranging from 1433 to 1440, although one could guess that the date would fall closer to the earlier years given the prince's closeness in timeline to Mehmed II and Vlad III, both born in the early 1430s. Stefan was the grandson of Alexander the Good of Moldavia, and the son of Bogdan II and Maria Altea. Historians speculate that Stefan likely had around 5 siblings, although with the great commonality of illegitimate offspring in Stefan and his father's time, that number may be quite different in reality. Stefan himself is also believed to have fathered a handful of legitimate and possibly many more illegitimate children between his multiple wives and affairs. It's assumed that the great Moldavian fathered 2 or 3 sons named Alexandru alone, with one having been from a woman by the name of Marushka or Marika that some claim to have been his first wife, though the legitimacy of this is scrutinized. Stefan's later wives included the likes of Evdokia of Kiev, Maria of Mangup, and Maria Voykitsa, with all 3 women and other mistresses birthing multiple heirs for the prince. But in spite of Stefan's colorful record when it came to his marital and familial relations, he was and continues to be viewed as a Christian hero. This is in large part due to him being the mastermind of one of the greatest European victories against the Ottoman Empire in all of history, but with additional credit to his insistence on building dozens of new churches throughout his reign. Pope Sixtus IV would award the prince with the title of Adlita Christi for his efforts, and historians note that many Moldavians began to regard Stefan as a saint almost immediately after his death, though he would not be canonized until June of 1992. Nevertheless, a man such as Stefan boasts far more to his story than wives, heirs, and titles. Stefan was a prince, a military commander, and a friend or enemy to some of history's most famous faces, and it all started with the aid and death of his father. Young Stefan's first taste of princedom came when his father named him co-ruler and heir to the Moldavian throne before he'd even reached adulthood. It was also around this time that Stefan's cousin, Vlad III Dracula, had come to seek refuge under Bogdan's protection after being ousted from the Wallachian throne at the end of 1448. The relationship between the boys is assumed to have been good, and when Bogdan was murdered by his own brother, Peter III Aaron, Stefan and Vlad escaped together and found their way to John Hunyadi of Hungary and Transylvania. The details of what happened over the next few years are murky, but eventually, Vlad would garner enough support from Hunyadi to invade Wallachia, violently oust another cousin of his, Vladislav II, and retake his rightful throne by the end of 1456. During this period, Stefan had either joined Vlad on the military expedition or made his way to his relative's court following the victory. The next year, Vlad would do Stefan the same favor he had received from Hunyadi himself, and Stefan was successfully crowned Voivode of Moldavia. This meant dethroning his uncle Peter Aaron, who subsequently fled to nearby Poland in hopes of slipping from Stefan's vengeful wrath without a scratch. This may have worked at first, but the new Moldavian prince wasn't quick to forgive and forget, nor would he risk another betrayal by his father's brother and killer. Thus, Stefan launched an attack against Poland with the hope of deterring King Casimir IV from backing the Pretender. The result of the 1458 campaign was hopeful for the spirited Moldavian. Stefan and Casimir came to an agreement, signing a treaty in the spring of 1459, with the former promising to aid the Poles in their conflicts with the Tartars, while Casimir, who was now confirmed as suzerain over Moldavia, would prevent Peter Aron from returning to Stefan's princedom. With that, Peter was on the move again, and Stefan's ability to forgive was no more present than it had been before. Peter's attempts to settle in Transylvania were challenged by Stefan's repeated and forced incursions on the Siki lands, and the Pretender eventually gave up once more. With John Hunyadi's son now on the Hungarian throne, Peter fled next to Buda, where he was given support and protection. The Moldavian prince would give his uncle a momentary break from being on the run, but this would not be their last encounter just yet. Nevertheless, Stefan had more to focus on than just his enemies. In fact, he was strategically looking to reduce the number of those he had, and thus he now sought to implement friendly relations with both his allies in Poland and with the Ottoman Empire. Having agreed to pay a yearly tribute to the latter, the Moldavian would begin to see the Sultan as more of a friend than his own blood over in Wallachia, in an unusual shift of allegiances. For reasons we cannot exactly pin down, the bond between Stefan and Vlad was suddenly on a downhill spiral. Distrust was creeping up on both ends, and it seems that both felt a military clash was soon inevitable. It's possible that the motive, at least on Stefan's end, came from the fact that Chilia, which had previously been a Moldavian possession, was now under the guardianship of the Hungarians and their Wallachian allies. Stefan had long wanted to retake the territory, and it seems that its new owners would not give it up without a fight. A fight that the wily Prince of Moldavia was willing to start, even if it meant going to war with the cousin who'd helped him take his crown to begin with. By mid-1462, Wallachia was at war with the Ottoman Empire, and Moldavia decided to join in. Stefan, with the help of his Ottoman allies, laid siege to Chilia. Despite the military prowess and numerical capabilities, 8 days after the siege had begun, the Ottoman-Moldavian coalition was forced to accept defeat. Stefan himself had in fact received such a severe leg injury that it would never fully heal, a painful reminder of one of the great prince's few failures, and in the face of a former friend nonetheless. 3 years later, Stefan's determination to seize his principality's former lands was as strong as ever. With Vlad Dracula now imprisoned by his alleged allies in Hungary, his little brother Radu was on the Wallachian throne at the behest of the Ottomans, whom Stefan no longer felt a generously cordial toward. As a result, in 1465, Stefan began a new siege on Chilia. This time, the campaign would last for only 2 intense days, and it would end in the Moldavian's successful capture of the fortress he had yearned for so long. The fallout from this victorious endeavor would be that Stefan had now alienated all who laid claim to Chilia, the Wallachians, Ottomans, and Hungarians. The latter was particularly angered by Stefan's voracious expedition, and Matthias Corvinus quickly gathered his own force to retaliate, and thus carried out an invasion of Moldavia. The Hungarian king managed to seize the Moldavian possession of Baia, but would later scarcely escape with his life intact as the war effort collapsed and Stefan retook the captured land. If anything important had come from this, it was the fact that it only solidified Stefan's loyalty to Casimir as opposed to Corvinus. Stefan knew that warfare had been, and still was, a constant during his dynamic reign, and having strong allies was crucial if one was to protect his own territory. Thus, as the Moldavians restarted their raids into the Hungary-aligned region of Transylvania, Stefan swore fealty to the Poles once again. If he was now to face his neighbors in Wallachia, the Hungarians and the Ottomans, he needed someone at his side when duty called. But the Polish-Moldavian alliance had required Stefan to make new enemies in the form of the Tartars, and in 1470, those of the Golden Horde launched an incursion into Moldavian lands. After initially wreaking havoc through Poland, an occasion that Casimir had failed to prevent nor put an end to, the Tartars made their way to Moldavia in hopes of doing the same. Here, it would be Stefan who would rain on their parade and rout the invaders in multiple face-offs, finally giving the death blow near Dniester. To no one's surprise, the Wallachians were next to try their hand at defeating Stefan, now launching a hopeful campaign to retake Chilia. But this too would fall apart. The ensuing months would see Stefan preoccupied with repeated clashes against his neighbors in Wallachia, giving the prince's much-forgotten uncle and rival a chance to weasel his way back into the picture. While his nephew was busy defending his border, Peter began rallying support among the Sikis of Transylvania, convincing himself and them that, with their aid, he could retake the Moldavian throne. While Peter would ultimately succeed at gathering troops and invading his homeland, he had been wrong about everything else. Stefan crushed his challengers and took his uncle captive, naturally having him executed and ridding himself of the nuisance once and for all. And then, it was back to war with Radu and the Wallachians. As this rivalry carried on, Stefan's relationship with both the Poles and Ottomans was rapidly deteriorating. Bickering over who didn't do enough for who with Casimir echoed debates with Mehmed about who should possess Chilia. Knowing that he may be on the verge of turning two once allies into enemies, Stefan opted to send envoys to his Hungarian counterpart with the goal of at least winning over Corvinus. By the end of 1473, the Prince of Moldavia had had enough of the Sultan and his puppet next door. Having ceased paying his yearly tribute to the Ottomans, Stefan kicked off a new invasion of Wallachia, this time aimed at ousting his little cousin in favor of a new protege, Basarab III Laiota. A week of battle and overpowering the Wallachians saw Stefan victoriously seize the neighboring throne and crown Basarab Laiota in Radu's place, though this would be short-lived. It wouldn't be long before the Ottoman-backed Radu came marching back and deposed the newly placed voivode. Basarab then returned, and the exchange happened again. More repetitions would play out before Radu finally fled, letting Basarab at last establish a real reign over the Wallachian Principality. But this was far from the end of Stefan's troubles with the Ottomans. In fact, it was only the beginning. While the whiplash over who would rule Wallachia had been occurring, the Ottomans, Wallachians, Poles, Hungarians, and Moldavians had all been preparing for war and engaging in it. In January, Stefan's only accomplishment wasn't reseating his protege on the Wallachian throne. His greatest accomplishment was winning one of the greatest military victories in European history. As Basarab Laiota and Radu fought for control over Wallachia, the relationship between the heads of Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire was utterly falling apart. To make the situation even more complicated, in the chaos, Basarab had turned his back on his biggest supporter in Stefan. Once established on the Wallachian throne, Basarab had caved under the pressure of the Ottoman Sultan, essentially agreeing to vassalship under Mehmed as opposed to Stefan and his allies. Tensions were building, and war was nearing. Stefan, knowing that it was only a matter of time before he would again be facing off with the Ottomans and Wallachians, began to enlist support from his fellow Christians. His effort reached all the way to the Pope himself, but the aid he actually received was less impressive than he had aimed for. Both Hungary and Poland, very likely due to their proximity to Moldavia and the dangers they would face if Stefan were to lose, offered support in the form of troops. The kings of both neighboring countries gave around 2,000 men to assist the Moldavian cause, in great contrast to the 5,000 Siki men that Stefan himself was able to win over. The Moldavian army alone numbered around 40,000 men, showing clearly the reluctance with which Stefan's Hungarian and Polish allies wished to truly join his fight. And with this, the Moldavians would thus be greatly outnumbered. The Ottoman cavalrymen numbered around 30,000, with the entirety of the invading force coming to at least 60,000. Furthermore, Basarab Leota had now fully invested himself in his newfound alliance with Mehmed, and subsequently offered another 17,000 soldiers to join those under Hadim Suleiman Pasha at Mehmed's orders. With each army established, the clock ticked ever closer to the moment of battle. By the time Suleiman Pasha's force had arrived in Moldavia, Stefan had already been preparing for their arrival. Much like other military geniuses of his time, the Moldavian prince enacted a combined policy of scorched earth and tactical sabotage. Wells were poisoned, and any potential food or supplies left behind were burned and destroyed, leaving the already tired Ottomans after their long journey in an even more difficult position. Guerrilla attacks followed, and it seems that Stefan and his men were off to a good start. The goal was to lure the Ottoman forces near Vaslui, an area where an innocent teenage Stefan had stood his ground alongside his older cousin, Vlad Dracula. He knew this battlefield like the back of his hand, and was certain that it would prove advantageous for his own men. The marshy valley the voivode aimed to utilize was engulfed by forested hills, and the worn-out invaders would struggle to march through the unideal terrain. Even just to reach the full extent of the Moldavian troops, the Ottomans would have to cross the brittle Podul Inalt over the Barlad River, a bridge that could scarcely support the crossing of an army. Nevertheless, Suleiman Pasha led his men forth, and Stefan readied his. Thick fog blanketed the valley and its surroundings. Moldavian archers, cavalry, and cannons were peppered throughout it. The Ottomans were close, but caught no sight of the defenders. Moving through nearly non-existent visibility, a portion of the Moldavian army and its Siki allies were accompanied by a handful of musicians as they marched toward the center of the wet valley. On cue, the musicians began to play their instruments, the sound of drums and bugles startling Suleiman Pasha and his men as they scrambled to catch a glimpse of their enemies through the thick fog. Unable to do so, the Ottomans assumed that in the direction of the instruments, they would find the whole of Stefan's forces. This was, of course, not the case at all. Stefan was more competent than to throw all of his eggs in one basket, and he in fact had quite a different plan in mind. As the Ottoman forces neared, Moldavian archery and artillery fire began. Cavalrymen came face to face, and in a short amount of time, the battle was in full swing. At some point, the bridge crumbled under the weight of Ottoman cavalry, and the rest of Suleiman's efforts weren't faring much better. By now, Stefan was ordering the engagement of his remaining forces. and the valley was suddenly flooded with Moldavian defenders. Chaos erupted on the Ottoman side, and it wasn't long before Süleyman Pasha ordered his men into a hurried retreat. Stefan and his defenders chased their fleeing invaders for days, racking up the total Ottoman casualties by thousands. The end result reaching over 40,000. The Wallachian troops, who had been alleged allies of Süleyman Pasha's side, left the battlefield without a single engagement, with Basarab Laiota abruptly deciding to switch alliances yet again. Basarab Laiota furthermore shunned any remaining Ottomans from his own lands, and with that, the Battle of Vaslui had ended. This victory would be viewed as one of the greatest triumphs in European history. Stefan had been wildly outnumbered and with limited external support, and yet through ingenuity and military aptitude, he had won nevertheless. Despite withholding actual support for Stefan, Pope Sixtus named him an Adlita of Christ in response to his fearless efforts against the Ottomans. Still, the Poles and Hungarians too failed to provide further aid in spite of Stefan's ability to prove his skill set against their shared enemy. And with a furious Mehmed now plotting his revenge, Stefan would likely need it. Amassing minimal assistance from those who could provide the most, Stefan decided to try a new strategy. Having become aware of Basarab Laiuta's early endorsement of the Ottoman war efforts, the Prince of Moldavia was ready yet again to make a swap under the Wallachian throne. But this time, he was going back to an old friend. A cousin, to be precise. Vlad the III Dracula, whose life had deteriorated quite tragically after he was forced to face Stefan and the Ottomans at once, had been imprisoned following a betrayal by Matthias Corvinus back in 1462. Now, 13 years later, Stefan reached out to the Hungarian king with an unusual request. He wanted Vlad freed. With no one left he could comfortably rely on, Stefan knew that his cousin was his only hope of retaking Wallachia and standing up to the Ottoman Empire. Vlad in his own life had been riotously unwavering in his opposition to Sultan Mehmed, and if Stefan could win his forgiveness, the pair would be a formidable defense unit for the whole of Eastern Europe. And though Corvinus at first refused to support the cousins invading Wallachia together, he did agree to let his prisoner go. How they got back on the same page has been lost to history, but after his return to society, Vlad rapidly restored his relationship with Stefan. The duo agreed to stand by one another and unify the efforts of their principalities, making Moldavia and Wallachia friendly neighbors once more. All that was left now was to kick Basarab Laiota, voivode of Wallachia, to the curb. Unfortunately, still lacking support from the Hungarian king for a war with Wallachia, Stefan was forced to put his plan with Vlad on pause. In the meantime, the Ottomans had been busy wreaking havoc in Crimea and the Principality of Theodoro, something the Moldavian ruler was staunchly opposed to, and thus earned himself further support from the Venetians. Mehmed himself, at this time, was also preparing for another invasion of Moldavia, which he launched in short order. With the help of Laiota yet again and Crimean Tartars, the Sultan came back with a spirit of retribution, hoping to once and for all settle the score after his defeat in Vaslui. By the summer of 1476, Stefan and Mehmed were locked in battle at Valia Alba, and while home field advantage seemed to at first aid the Moldavians, favor quickly turned. The Ottomans, rallied by their leader, brutally massacred Stefan's defenders before the battle was over. It's said that the ground was littered with dead bodies, and even Mehmed's army lost many good men. Stefan himself was soon forced to retreat if he wished not to join his men on the ground beneath his feet. He escaped possibly as far as Poland as the Ottomans pushed forward to take more Moldavian territory. Mehmed's success after the Battle of Valia Alba was less impressive, and soon faced with an outbreak of disease and Stefan's return alongside an army led by Stefan V Bathory, the Ottomans had no choice but to pull out of Moldavia, at last giving Stefan the chance to once more look to his plan involving Wallachia and Vlad Dracula. With Moldavia temporarily at peace yet again, the voivode moved to solidify his loyalty to Matthias Corvinus, anticipating receiving approval for his invasion plan in exchange, and luckily for Stefan, he was right. With the go-ahead from the King of Hungary himself, Vlad Dracula and Stefan of Moldavia laid siege to Wallachia. By the end of the year, Basarab Leota, once Stefan's favored ruler and protege, was on the run, and Vlad III Dracula, after over a decade of unjust imprisonment, was finally back on the throne he had gained all those years ago alongside his cousin. Stefan, through leaving troops behind to aid his new ally, had returned to Moldavia after seeing the invasion of Wallachia through. This was a victory worth celebrating after such a long struggle with Moldavia's next-door neighbor. But tragically, it would be a short time of triumph. Before January 1477 came to a close, Vlad and almost every one of Stefan's bodyguards he'd left for his relative had been slaughtered when the Ottomans reinvaded. Some speculate betrayal was what finally took down Stefan's Wallachian cousin, while others believe it to have been a simple casualty of war. Either way, Stefan had supported Vlad with all his efforts in the final year of his life. But now, the voivode of Moldavia was left with no ally beside him, and no clear protege to groom for the job. He did, nevertheless, have a man by the name of Basarab IV, nicknamed Sepelush, and this man would do for the time being. The Ottomans had reinstated Leota in the place of Vlad Dracula, which, much like his reigns before and after Vlad's younger brother Radu, would not last. Stefan would have none such a circumstance, and entered Wallachia once again to oust his former confidant. Successful, Stefan placed the younger Basarab on the throne in what he hoped would be a more permanent rule. The subsequent months showed signs of promise, as peace treaties were signed, relationships, such as that between Stefan and Casimir, were strengthened, and plans for the future were discussed. Unfortunately for Stefan, however, the Ottomans remained an intimidating bunch. Basarab IV, much like the elder of his namesake, made peace with Sultan Mehmed. The Prince of Moldavia was grudgingly forced to follow suit, his contentment with this fact undoubtedly entirely non-existent. His work in Wallachia was again not finished, and he was now running out of options. Stefan attempted to replace yet another failed student, this time with a man by the name of Mircea, who many historians believe to be one of Stefan's own sons. But this task failed. Basarab IV now had Ottoman support, and for the time being, the Moldavians were unable to overpower them. War broke out on Moldavia's battered soil for another period, and the tireless Stefan was forced to accept that peace was still nowhere in his near future. If Stefan had grown tired of warring with the Ottoman Empire, he was yet to show it. He hadn't backed down before, and he wasn't going to now. The Moldavians' counterpart furthermore had shown remarkable resilience over the years, fighting both Stefan and his neighbors. Neither was going to give up, and thus the rivalry was surely endless. At least, until death do them part, and that's exactly what happened. Sultan Mehmed, the great conqueror of Constantinople, died on May 3rd, 1481. The death of Stefan's peer was far from the end of the war between the Ottomans and the Moldavians, but it meant another crucial pause in battle. With the Sultan dead, a clash for who would succeed the throne followed, forcing the Ottomans to pull their attention away from Stefan and his principality. While Mehmed's sons, Chaim and Bayezid II, turned their animosity towards each other, the Moldavian prince decided to slip back into Wallachia and settle some unfinished business with yet another one of his former protégés, Basarab IV. It would come as no surprise when the master ruthlessly defeated the student. Stefan discarded Basarab and placed another man, the half-brother of Vlad Dracula, also named Vlad, on his empty throne. As was the pattern, Basarab soon returned with Ottoman troops in tow, but Stefan had won by skill, not luck, the last time. Thus, not only would Basarab lose again, but this time he was slain in the process. Vlad the monk, as Stefan's somewhat distant relative was known, was secured for the time being as the ruler of Wallachia, but his support in Moldavia would soon be called into question when the Ottomans came knocking. Despite his endorser's current conflict with the past sultan and his new successor Bayezid, Vlad would accept vassalship under the Ottomans as many of his predecessors had done before. And while Stefan himself was no stranger to doing just that, it had not been his plan now, and Vlad the monk had put himself on thin ice. Prioritizing strategy and timing over his immediate disapproval, Stefan opted to leave his new failed puppet for a bit longer. Instead of invading Wallachia again just yet, the Prince of Moldavia was tactically bulking up his border while looking to new nations for fresh support. In his search, he found Ivan III of Moscow, who would soon form a notable bond with Stefan. This was a great secret weapon for the latter, though it wouldn't yet come in much handy, as 1484 would see the Ottomans return their focus to subduing the wily Moldavian. In 1483, the new Sultan Bayezid and Hungary's Matthias Corvinus had finally come to an agreement of their own and signed another peace treaty to last 5 years, possibly due to Corvinus's need to focus on his unrelated plans in the West. Whatever the reason, the truce was set to include Moldavia as well, although it was agreed that the ports of Stefan's principality would be the exception. And in case anyone had been unsure as to why, the Ottomans soon gave an explanation by launching a new campaign to seize Chilia and later Citata Alba, giving Bayezid and his empire suzerainty over the Black Sea and an upper hand on Stefan of Moldavia yet again. The cornered voivode now had an Ottoman ally to the south, another to the west, and the Ottomans themselves on his own soil. With what one can only assume would have been an immense level of exasperation, Stefan submitted to Bayezid, utilizing his only logical method of expelling the Ottoman armies from his land. Matthias Corvinus was now in a tricky situation. On the one hand, he was determined to maintain friendly relations with Bayezid so he could focus elsewhere. And on the other, he now had a cornered and dangerous Moldavian prince who could blow the whole scheme up in a matter of minutes. Hoping to delay a reaction from the latter, it's believed that Corvinus granted Stefan the territories of Chichiu and Citata de Baeta in Transylvania as compensation, although some historians question the timing of these gifts. Either way, Corvinus was not open to military conflicts with the Ottomans, and thus no consideration was given to the idea of letting Stefan retake his ports. Poland, contrarily, had been watching all of this unfold, and King Casimir was not as forgiving as his Hungarian peer. The idea of the Ottomans controlling Moldavia's ports and thus the surrounding area, Danube and Dnieper rivers, was an unacceptable one for Poland's Casimir. By 1485, the king had seen enough and knew it was only a matter of time before his own nation's trade with their eastern neighbors was affected by Bayezid's new territorial control. To what would have been a profound pleasure for Stefan, Casimir's disdain for the Ottoman encroachment pushed him into closer cooperation with the Moldavian. As the fall of 1485 rolled around, Stefan made his way to Poland to personally pay homage to the king and solidify their renewed friendship. Casimir repaid the prince by declaring his opposition to Bayezid's snatching of the Moldavian ports and vowed to never accept the territorial changes without Stefan's personal consent. As invigorating as this all must have been for the voivode, he still mustn't have been surprised to hear that, in his absence, the Ottomans had re-entered Moldavia. Luckily, not much had been done by the time Stefan and his new Polish supporting forces came racing back to Moldavian land. The attackers were routed by the year's end. Although the Ottomans still controlled Cetata Alba and Chilia, this would have been inordinately aggravating for Stefan, considering the desperate amount of times he'd had to go to war for Chilia in particular over the decades, even having betrayed his own cousin and been permanently wounded for a losing battle over it. It's not surprising then that a few months later, the voivode again tried to recapture his ports, but still, he couldn't seem to best his foes, a common trend for anyone attacking the fortresses. Having scarcely survived this defeat, Stefan again was painfully forced to consider renegotiating with the Ottomans and paying homage once more to his great dismay. Having been so hopeful at the start of this newest struggle, it seems the Moldavian prince quickly became aware that Poland's support wasn't enough. He thus signed a new truce with Bayezid, promising 3 more years of paying tribute and accepting vassalship. If any part of Stefan had held out hope that his Polish friends would continue the fight without him, as 1489 rolled around, those hopes would have been dashed. Casimir and Bayezid made peace, and the former seemed to have forgotten his existing agreement with the Prince of Moldavia. The King of Poland gave his own consent for the official acknowledgement of the Ottoman capture of Chilia and Cetata Alba. Stefan, again cornered, saw this as a complete betrayal and breach of his alliance with Casimir, ironically swaying his loyalty back towards the man who'd lost it just before, Matthias Corvinus. Stefan's objective was thus to re-strengthen his relationship with the King of Hungary, as that was by now his best option to protect himself and oppose the Ottoman overreach. Unfortunately for the voivode, much like his plan to solidify Vlad Dracula once more as his next-door neighbor and ally, this one too ended in death. Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, died on April 6, 1490. In a similar fashion to the death of Sultan Mehmed, a succession crisis erupted before the ruler's body could even go cold. There would be 4 claimants to the dead man's throne. Corvinus himself had attempted to groom his illegitimate son John for the role, but with his death died that dream. His challengers included 2 sons of Polish King Casimir, John Albert and Vladislaus, as well as Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire and Habsburg dynasty. Now, Stefan had to decide who to support if he was to continue siding with the Hungarians over the Poles and Ottomans. Possibly due to his own approval of Stefan, the Moldavian chose to back Maximilian. Standing behind Casimir's sons could risk a future unification of both his unstable off-and-on allies, but there apparently wasn't much benefit from backing John Corvinus either. It would eventually be Vladislaus, however, who would be crowned as Matthias' successor. While Maximilian accepted this outcome and simply abandoned his own claim, John Albert wasn't so quick to give up. Brothers or not, Albert did not want Vladislaus on the throne. This made Stefan's life more complicated, as he now had to decide who to support between the 2 men he had particularly hoped not to see succeed. Knowing that John Albert was already the chosen heir to Casimir's throne in Poland, the voivode eventually opted to endorse Vladislaus, predicting that this case would make a union between Hungary and Poland less likely. Not only had Stefan been stabbed in the back by his Polish ally after the conflict with the Ottomans, but he'd also been tussling with the Poles over the territory of Pokutia, which the prince felt entitled to take back into Moldavian control. If John Albert ever ascended to the thrones of both Hungary and Poland, Stefan would lose his ability to switch up alliances at will, as he'd done all these years, and he would quite possibly be making an enemy out of two kingdoms. Thus, Stefan doubled down on his newfound support of Vladislaus, giving him aid when the Ottomans invaded Hungary throughout the low-boiling succession crisis that was still ongoing. He was repaid by the rightful king, who responded by confirming Moldavia's claim to the Transylvanian holdings previously granted to Stefan by Matthias Corvinus, and finally, for Stefan, it appeared that one of his ideals was working out. By the end of 1491, John Albert had finally accepted his brother's place on the Hungarian throne. But the following year, yet another death would stir up new drama. The voivode again had to navigate a neighboring change of power when King Casimir IV died in the summer of 1492. Stefan's tumultuous roller coaster was far from its end. The succession crises that had occurred in the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary must have had Stefan eyeing Poland with great anticipation after the announcement of King Casimir's passing. Whether he was hoping to see another struggle for power as he'd taken advantage of with Sultan Mehmed's death, or worried about what such a war could entail as in the case of King Corvinus's death, would be his little secret. But either way, no crisis took place. John Albert would take Casimir's throne in Poland, while his younger brother, Alexander, would be crowned in Lithuania. The Prince of Moldavia now just had to determine how he would react. Throughout Stefan's entire reign thus far, he had shown his remarkable intellect and strategic abilities when it came to handling foreign affairs. He knew at all times to keep a close watch on all of his neighbors and lean in favor of whoever would benefit him and his principality best at the time. Thus, the voivode lacked a strong, immediate reaction to the changes in Poland and Lithuania. Knowing that he had friends in Moscow, Hungary, and part-time allies in Poland and the Ottoman Empire, there was no reason to stir the pot just yet. But when Casimir's sons decided to meet in Lucca in the spring of 1494, Stefan paid close attention. The aim of the meeting between Vladislaus of Hungary, John of Poland, and Alexander of Lithuania was to plan a joint campaign against the Ottoman Empire, which they all could now agree was their shared foe. This spirit of cooperation was, however, quickly tainted by John Albert's own ideas, particularly concerning Moldavia. Despite Vladislaus's friendship with the nearby voivode, John wanted to overthrow Stefan in favor of Casimir's other son, Sigismund. An air of suspicion would soon make its way to the Moldavian prince himself, who thus began to distrust the new king of Poland. Stefan, being the observant man he was, believes that John Albert wanted to strengthen his control over Moldavia, and when John shortly launched an attack on the Ottomans occupying Chilia and Città Alba, these fears seemed to be confirmed. Despite a notable effort to stop the Polish king, Stefan was unable to interfere with the campaign and subsequently turned to his ally in Moscow for assistance. Ivan III was quick to back his ally and friend, and thus reached out to Alexander of Lithuania with a request that he stay out of his brother's war. Possibly due to the shared opinions of many Lithuanian nobles, Alexander agreed to steer clear of the conflict and thus save Stefan from an added threat. This still wasn't enough to change the mind of John Albert, though, and by the summer of 1497, Polish troops broke down the door into Moldavia. Stefan had seen this coming. Having made sure to remain on good terms with Sultan Bayezid, the incursion allows the Moldavian prince to receive a few hundred men in arms from the Ottoman Empire to aid his territory's defense. Meanwhile, attempting to end the conflict from both angles, Stefan sent his chancellor, a man by the name of Isaac, to meet with the Polish king and diplomatically request an end to the assault. If John Albert had been a man of diplomacy, his skills at it had surely lapsed at this time, as he responded to Isaac's request by throwing him in prison. The war consequently raged on, as the Poles now pushed deeper into Moldavia. They were expecting additional Teutonic troops to arrive any day, but Stefan himself was welcoming over 10,000 Hungarians onto his side thanks to John's brother across the border. The Polish king was alone, and the Moldavians had the backing of both Hungary and the Ottomans, as well as help. The Polish troops were contrastingly blindsided by a plague outbreak, and their ongoing siege, not Stefan's defenses, were crumbling to dust. By the end of October, the tables had turned, and the voivode was ruthlessly chasing his invaders out. Either they left Moldavian soil or died on it. A string of Moldavian raids into Poland reinforced the point in case anyone had misunderstood, and John Albert was now faced with the facts that many before him had too leaned the hard way. Stefan wasn't going anywhere. A new alliance was soon created between Hungary, Poland, and Moldavia, with Stefan further securing his standing as more than just an average prince among kings. By now, though, the crafty Moldavian was aging and had already begun grooming his son, Bogdan, to take his throne in the coming years. The voivode had reigned for decades over a period of relative stability for his people, particularly in contrast to the rapid changes of authority in neighboring Wallachia. To oust Stefan of Moldavia from power would have been as easy as ripping the stars from the sky, and his people, in many cases, adored him. He was viewed by many boyars as cruel and tyrannical, but by the peasantry often as their guardian and a just ruler. This discrepancy may come from his tendency to reward those who supported his strong central government, which often included the lower classes of nobility over the entitled boyars. He was undeniably seen as a supporter of the church nonetheless, as he had many new churches constructed, rewarded the church with lands, and encouraged monasticism. His view on foreigners, however, would serve often as another reason to critique the long-reigning prince, as he was not afraid to persecute certain groups such as Hussites, Roma, and Jews. Contrarily, though, Stefan was often found to look to experts from outside his borders when it came to expanding his understanding of topics such as politics and the like. It's possible that his involvement with these foreigners helped contribute to his innate ability to play puppet master with his neighbors, moving kings and emperors against each other and in favor of himself like pieces on a chessboard. His awareness and political genius were startling, and a pillar of his reign and ability to maintain power so unwaveringly. His abilities at war were no less dazzling, however, and necessary. If the voivode himself is to be believed, he fought 36 battles and won 34 of them. He often had help from his allies in the form of manpower, which cannot be ignored. But neither can the simple fact that his cleverness and resourcefulness is the reason why he managed to always have aid. Stefan's reputation had been set, but his time as Prince of Moldavia was not over yet. He was tasked with guiding his son in the same direction as he'd gone all these years. One of Bogdan's first and most crucial acts as Stefan's co-ruler was to aid in the renegotiation of peace with Poland and, as of 1499, the end of Polish suzerainty over Moldavia. A year later, The father and son duo would cease paying tribute to the Sultan and send words to Venice with an offer to join the Ottoman-Venetian War and a request for a doctor to help treat Stefan's declining health. Matteo Mariano, a Venetian physician, was sent in response to Stefan's request, but Moldavian attempts to re-engage in war with the Ottomans failed, and efforts to retake Chilia and Città Alba came up short. Over the next few years, clashes with the Ottomans, Tartars, and Poles would follow, but peace was eventually made again in 1503, and Stefan agreed to once more pay a yearly tribute to the Ottoman Empire. Before his death, the voivode would press his son on the issue, insisting that he too continue to pay their share to the Sultan. And with Stefan's doctor now deceased, a new request went out for another in hopes of extending his own rule for just a little longer. But the prince was old, drained after so many decades of war and politics. His leg, which had never healed after his clash with Vlad Dracula over his beloved Chilia, was no longer the worst of his ailments. He was fading away, and he could. He had left his mark over 47 years of voivodeship. He had prepared his son to take over his duties, and there was nothing left for him to do. It is only a shame that he died on July 2nd, 1504, knowing that Chilia still remained out of Moldavian hands. It may very well have been Stefan the Great's only regret.